June 4th, 1942, the sun climbed over the Pacific horizon like a crimson eye. Watching as Commander Mitsuo Fukuda stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, his leather flight jacket creaking against the morning chill. He had 11 minutes, just 11 minutes before the American carriers would unleash a storm of 216 aircraft that would change the course of history forever. The morning air tasted of salt and engine oil, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the gray curtain of clouds, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were preparing to write the Imperial Japanese Navy's obituary in fire and steel. Fukuda had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, a strike so devastating that it had awakened a sleeping giant. Now, near a tiny atoll called Midway, that giant was about to strike back with a vengeance that would echo through generations. The Japanese fleet had sailed with confidence, believing there for carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were invincible. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded this armada, the same force that had terrorized the Pacific since December 7th, 1941. The operation had been Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's brainchild, a complex strategy designed to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. Yamamoto understood America's industrial might better than most Japanese officers. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew that Japan's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The attack on Midway was supposed to extend that window. Instead, it would slam shut like a steel trap, according to accounts preserved in naval history and Heritage Command archives. The morning of June 4th began with confusion and miscommunication aboard the Japanese carriers. Scout planes had been delayed in launching due to catapult problems on the cruiser Tome. When scout plane number 4 finally reported enemy ships at 7:48 that morning, it sent shock waves through the command structure, but the pilot's initial report was vague. He hadn't confirmed whether carriers were present among the American vessels. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo faced an impossible decision. His aircraft were armed with land attack bombs intended for Midway Island's installations. If American carriers were nearby, he needed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The minutes ticked away like hammer blows as ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm the aircraft. Bombs were wheeled across the hangar decks, torpedoes were rolled into position, and aviation fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking. Commander Fukuda watched this organized chaos with growing dread. He had been wounded during the Pearl Harbor operation and now served as an observer, his combat flying days temporarily behind him. From his vantage point, he could see the vulnerability of the moment aircraft packed together, fuel lines exposed, ammunition scattered across the deck. The carriers had become floating bombs, and the Americans were about to light the fuse. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports. American torpedo bombers were approaching. The Combat Air Patrol Japanese Zero fighters circling overhead scrambled to intercept them. From the decks below, sailors could hear the distant thunder of engines and the staccato bark of anti-aircraft guns, beginning their deadly symphony. Time had become the enemy. At 9:18 on the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet toward the Japanese fleet. His 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flew low and slow, their obsolete airframes making them easy targets for the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. Waldron had written a letter to his wife the night before, somehow sensing he wouldn't return. He was right. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft would be shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from the water. But Waldron's sacrifice, and that of the other torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, accomplished something crucial. They drew the Japanese fighter cover down to wave top level. The Zeros, and magnificent fighters piloted by some of Japan's most experienced aviators, swooped down like hawks, their 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons tearing through the American torpedo bombers. The sky became a killing field, with burning aircraft spiraling into the ocean, trailing black smoke like funeral shrouds. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Carrier Task Force from Enterprise, had launched his strike at 7 o'clock that morning. The decision to launch at that range beyond the normal operational distance was a calculated risk. His aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return, but surprise was worth the gamble. Spruance was a cruiser admiral thrust into carrier command when Admiral William Halsey fell ill with dermatitis. Many had doubted his ability to lead carriers in combat, but he would prove them spectacularly wrong. The American strike force of 216 aircraft had become separated. During the flight to the target, navigation over the featureless Pacific was an art as much as science. Some squadrons flew the wrong heading entirely. Others arrived at different times. But this accidental dispersal would work in their favor, maintaining constant pressure on the Japanese fleet and preventing Nagumo from launching his own strike, as documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations. During the Second World War, the chaos of the morning battle created a window of vulnerability that the Americans would exploit with devastating effectiveness. The torpedo attacks, though suicidal and unsuccessful in scoring hits, had disrupted Japanese operations completely. Nagumo's carriers couldn't launch aircraft while under attack, and his fighters couldn't gain altitude to protect against high-altitude dive bombers. While engaging torpedo planes at sea level, Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, 33 Douglas SPD Dauntless aircraft, in a desperate search for the Japanese fleet. He had flown past the expected intercept point and found nothing but empty ocean. His fuel gauge showed he was approaching the point of no return. Many pilots would have turned back. McCluskey kept searching, and his persistence would change the war. At 10:22, McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northeast at full speed. The destroyer had been dropping depth charges on the American submarine Nautilus and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like a thread through the labyrinth, and at 10:25, he saw them for Japanese carriers in a box formation, their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The mathematics of catastrophe played out in the brilliant morning sky above the Japanese carriers. 3 squadrons of American dive bombers, McCluskey's from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's from Yorktown, arrived simultaneously at 10:26, completely by accident. The odds of such perfect timing were astronomical, yet there they were, poised at 14,000 feet like avenging angels, with the entire Japanese striking force spread beneath them like toys on a blue table. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo had just given the order to launch. The ray-arming nightmare was complete. His bombers were loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, their engines warming up, fuel lines still connected. In minutes, they would be airborne and heading toward the American carriers. The battle could still be won. Then someone shouted and pointed skyward. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best led Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6 into their dive. The SPD Dauntless, a sturdy aircraft with perforated dive brakes that screamed like banshees when deployed, tipped over and plunged toward Akagi. The dive bomber pilots had trained for this moment for months, practicing against targets pulled by tugs in Hawaii. Now the target was real, and it was trying to dodge. Best's 1,000-pound bomb, released at 1,500 feet, struck Akagi amidships, punching through the flight deck near the midship elevator. The explosion detonated fueled and armed aircraft in the hangar deck below. Torpedoes began cooking off. Aviation fuel spread like liquid fire. Within seconds, Akagi was transformed from a warship into an inferno. The ship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack was dying, and her death was agonizing. 200 yards away, Kaga suffered an even worse fate, for bombs struck within seconds of each other, as recorded in the detailed action reports preserved at the Naval War College archives. One bomb hit near the bridge, killing most of the command staff instantly. Another penetrated the flight deck forward, starting massive fires. The ship's damaged control parties fought valiantly, but the flames spread faster than they could contain them. Fuel and ammunition created a chain reaction of explosions that turned the carrier eye into a floating volcano. Soryu, the third carrier, took 3 bombs from Yorktown's bombers. Lieutenant Commander Leslie had released his own bomb prematurely due to an electrical malfunction, but his squadron didn't need his example. They dove through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of explosive shells and streams of tracer rounds. Soryu's wooden flight deck splintered under the impact of 1,000-pound bombs. Fire consumed her within minutes, spreading so rapidly that many crew members had no time to escape below decks. In just 5 minutes, from 10:26 to 10:31 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were transformed into burning wrecks. The mighty Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was mortally wounded. The 11 minutes that Fukuda had calculated were compressed into 5. The Americans hadn't even used all 216 aircraft, just enough dive bombers to change history. Commander Fukuda, watching from Akagi's deck, felt the ship shudder beneath his feet as bombs struck home. The explosion knocked him down, and when he struggled to his feet, the ship was already burning uncontrollably. While 3 Japanese carriers burned, Hiryu remained untouched. hidden beneath a layer of clouds 8 miles north of the devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi commanded Hiryu, and he was arguably the most capable carrier admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Unlike Nagumo, who hesitated, Yamaguchi acted. At 10:54, just 23 minutes after the American dive bombers struck, he launched 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters toward the American fleet. If he couldn't save his sister carriers, he would at least make the Americans pay. The strike wave was led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, a veteran pilot who had flown in the China campaigns and at Pearl Harbor. His orders were simple: find the American carriers and destroy them. Kobayashi didn't need sophisticated reconnaissance. Black smoke from the burning Japanese carriers was visible for 50 miles, and he knew the Americans wouldn't be far away. He pushed his throttle forward and headed east, his wingmen following in tight formation. At 12:10 that afternoon, radar operators aboard Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at 46 miles. The warning gave the carrier precious minutes to prepare. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force from Yorktown, ordered his combat air patrol to intercept. Wildcat fighters climbed to meet the threat, but the Japanese had altitude advantage and numerical superiority in the sector. Several Vs broke through the fire screen. Yorktown's crew had been training for this moment since the war began. Damage control parties stood ready with hoses and foam equipment. Gunners manned their stations, from the 5-inch dual-purpose mounts to the 40mm Bofors guns and the 20mm Oerlikon cannons that bristled from every available space. The carrier began violent evasive maneuvers, her rudder hard over, her engine straining. 3 bombs hit Yorktown in rapid succession. The first struck near the island structure, penetrating 3 decks before exploding and killing many of the signal personnel. The second hit amidships, starting fires near the forward elevator. The third penetrated to the 4th deck and exploded near the forward engine room, rupturing fuel tanks and causing flooding. Smoke poured from the wounds, and the ship listed to port. For a moment, it seemed Yorktown would share the fate of the Japanese carriers, but American damage control was superior to anything the Japanese possessed, a fact documented extensively in historical analyses by the Naval War College. The Americans had studied the carrier battles earlier in the war, particularly the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, and learned critical lessons about surviving bomb hits. Within 2 hours, damage control parties had extinguished the fires, counter-flooded to correct the list, and restored partial power. Yorktown was making 17 knots by 2:30 that afternoon and preparing to recover aircraft. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 1:30 that afternoon, 10 Cape torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, the last offensive punch Hiryu could muster. These aircraft, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, found Yorktown still burning, but underway. To the Japanese pilots' amazement, they were attacking the same carrier they had bombed hours earlier. They assumed she was a different ship since no carrier could survive what they had already inflicted. Tominaga led his Kates into a coordinated torpedo attack, approaching from multiple angles to split the defensive fire. Yorktown's gunners fired desperately, filling the sky with steel. Several Japanese aircraft disintegrated under the onslaught, but others pressed home their attacks with samurai determination. The torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, rupturing fuel bunkers and flooding the forward engine room. The ship lost power completely, dead in the water, listing heavily. While Yorktown fought for survival, American search aircraft located Hiryu. At 3:30 that afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet rolled over into their attack dives. The last Japanese carrier twisted and turned, her anti-aircraft guns spitting defiance, but she couldn't escape her destiny. For bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, setting massive fires that spread through her hangar deck. By 5 o'clock, she was dead in the water, flames consuming her from within. Admiral Yamaguchi remained on the bridge as his ship burned around him. He had removed his cap and uniform jacket, preparing for death with the formal dignity expected of a samurai warrior. His staff begged him to abandon ship, but he refused. When Hiryu finally sank at 9 in the morning on June 5th, Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku went down with her, standing at attention on the bridge as the ocean closed over their heads. The battle had lasted less than 6 hours, but its consequences would ripple across decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost for irreplaceable fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. More critically, they had lost over 3,000 experienced sailors and aircrew, including some of Japan's most skilled pilots and mechanics. These men had trained for years in the harsh pre-war program that had made Japanese naval aviation the finest in the world. They could not be replaced. According to the comprehensive account in Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, published research that has become the definitive English language analysis of the battle, the Japanese had entered the battle with 248 aircraft and over 600 highly trained aircrew. By the end of June 4th, most of these men were dead or trapped aboard sinking ships. The Americans lost Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, along with approximately 147 aircraft and 300 men. The exchange rate was devastating. Admiral Yamamoto received news of the disaster aboard his flagship Yamato, which had remained hundreds of miles behind the carrier force. The architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor immediately understood what this meant. He had once told colleagues that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year after war began. But after that, he had no confidence. The 6 months were up, and so was Japan's run of victories. On the burning deck of Akagi, Captain Taijiro Aoki gave the order to abandon ship at 7:15 that evening. Commander Fukuda, injured and burned, was lowered over the side into a boat. He watched as sailors formed orderly lines, waiting their turn to leave the ship that had been their home and weapon. There was no panic, only the resigned discipline of men who knew they had witnessed the end of an era. Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, his face gray with shock and grief. The Japanese destroyers Arashi, Naoki, Hagakaze, and Meikaze stood by the burning carriers through the night, rescuing survivors from the oil-slicked water. At 4:50 on the morning of June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto gave the agonizing order, "Scuttle the carriers." Destroyers moved alongside the burning hulks and fired torpedoes into their sides. Akagi, the flagship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack, sank bow first at 5 in the morning. Kaga had already sunk at 7:25 the previous evening. Soryu had slipped beneath the waves at 7:13. By 9, all 4 carriers were gone, taking their secrets and their dead to the bottom of the Pacific, 2 miles down. Yorktown's story wasn't finished. Despite the damage she had suffered, the carrier remained afloat through the night of June 4th. At dawn on June 5th, salvage crews returned to the drifting ship. Hoping to save her, they reconnected power lines, fought residual fires, and began the process of getting her under tow. June 5th dawned gray and threatening, with low clouds scudding across the Pacific swells. The destroyer Hammond had come alongside Yorktown, providing power and pumping equipment to the salvage crews working desperately to save the wounded carrier. On Yorktown's canning decks, sailors cut away wreckage, shored up bulkheads, and pumped water from flooded compartments. Admiral Fletcher had moved his flag to the cruiser Astoria, but he watched Yorktown struggle with the hope that she might yet reach Pearl Harbor for repairs. Commander Clarence Aldrich led the salvage operation with grim determination. By noon on June 5th, they had the fires out and the list reduced from 26 degrees to just 2 degrees. Pumps were making progress against the flooding. The destroyer Vireo had a tow line connected and was slowly pulling Yorktown eastward, away from the battle zone. For the first time since the torpedo hits, it seemed the carrier might survive. Then, at 1:31 that afternoon, disaster struck from below. Japanese submarine I-1-6-8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American task force for days. On the afternoon of June 5th, his periscope broke the surface to miles from Yorktown. Through the lens, Tanabe saw the wounded carrier and the screening destroyers. He maneuvered for 20 minutes, creeping closer at periscope depth, waiting for the perfect firing position. The American destroyers were focused on air defense, not anti-submarine work. It was a fatal mistake. At 1:36, Tanabe gave the order to fire. For Type 95 torpedoes leaped from I-1-6-8 single quotes S bow tubes, their oxygen propulsion systems leaving almost no wake. The first torpedo struck Hammond directly beneath her engineering spaces, breaking the destroyer's back. The ship folded in the middle like a closing book. Within minutes, Hammond sank, taking 81 sailors with her. Her depth charges exploded as she sank, killing many men already in the water. 2 more torpedoes struck Yorktown on her starboard side, tearing enormous holes below the waterline. The Old Girl, which had survived bombing and torpedo attack, which had fought at the Coral Sea and Midway, finally received her mortal wound. Water flooded in. Through the gaping wounds, the list increased rapidly, all hope of saving the ship evaporated in. The thunderous explosions. Throughout the night of June 5th and into the morning of June 6th, Yorktown remained afloat, refusing to die. A skeleton crew stayed aboard through the darkness, trying one last time to save her. But the ocean was patient, and it claimed her at dawn. At 5:04 on the morning of June 7th, 1942, Yorktown rolled onto her port side and slipped beneath the waves. She sank in 3,000 fathoms of water, her battle flag still flying, taking with her the memories of the battle she had fought and won. The strategic situation was now clear to both sides. Admiral Yamamoto had planned to draw the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. He had succeeded in the first part the Americans came to fight, but the second part had failed catastrophically. Instead of destroying the American carriers, he had lost for replaceable carriers and most of his experienced aircrew. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. Yamamoto canceled the invasion of Midway and withdrew the combined fleet westward. There would be no decisive battle, no knockout blow against American naval power. Instead, there would be a long, grinding war of attrition, precisely the kind of war Japan couldn't win, as Yamamoto had predicted. Before the war began, they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. The Americans, meanwhile, began to understand what they had accomplished. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, received the reports with cautious optimism. His intelligence staff, led by Commander Joseph Rockford, had broken the Japanese naval codes and given him the priceless gift of foreknowledge. That intelligence, combined with courage and luck, had delivered the victory at Midway. News of the battle remained secret for months. The American public, still reeling from defeats in the Philippines and the loss of Wake Island, heard only vague reports of a naval battle near Midway. The full scope of the victory wouldn't be revealed until much later. The human cost of those 11 minutes became clearer as the days passed. On Akagi, 867 men had died, including many of Japan's most experienced carrier mechanics and ordnance specialists. Kaga lost 811 men, many trapped below decks when the fire spread. Soryu's casualties reached 718 men, and Hiryu lost 416, including Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku. In total, over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died at Midway, a staggering loss of experienced personnel that Japan could never replace. The American losses, while significant, were far less crippling. Yorktown took 241 men down with her when she sank. The destroyer Hammond's loss added another 81 dead. Aircraft losses included many pilots and aircrew who had trained for months to master carrier operations. But American training programs could replace these men within months. Japanese programs, which had taken years to produce their elite pilots, could not match that pace. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda survived the battle and spent months recovering from his wounds in naval hospitals. He later wrote extensively about the battle, and his accounts, while sometimes self-serving, provide crucial insights into Japanese thinking and planning. According to his memoir Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, published after the war, the rearming confusion on the morning of June 4th was the fatal error that cost Japan the battle and ultimately the war. Historical analysis, particularly the research documented in Walter Lord's incredible victory and more recently in the Partial and Tully work cited earlier, suggests the Japanese made several critical errors beyond the rearming fiasco. Their reconnaissance was an inadequate scout plane number for launch late and failed to identify American carriers when it finally arrived on station. Their communication between aircraft and command was poor compared to American radio discipline. Their damage control training was insufficient for the intensity of modern carrier warfare. Most critically, the Japanese had become victims of their own success. 6 months of uninterrupted victory had bred a dangerous overconfidence. Japanese planning assumed American carriers would react slowly and defensively. Instead, Admiral Spruce ordered an aggressive, immediate launch at maximum range. That decision, controversial among his own staff, put American aircraft over the Japanese fleet at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. The battle also revealed fundamental differences in how the two navies approached carrier warfare. The Japanese concentrated their carriers into a single powerful striking force, which allowed for coordinated attacks but created a single point of failure. The Americans divided their carriers into separate task forces, which complicated coordination but ensured that losing one carrier wouldn't cripple the entire fleet. This difference in doctrine would persist throughout the war. From a tactical perspective, the 11 minutes that Japanese pilots had to prepare represented the time between when American torpedo bombers began their attacks and when dive bombers arrived overhead. The torpedo attack suicidal, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful in hitting any targets accomplished their strategic purpose. by drawing Japanese fighter cover down to sea level and preventing the Japanese carriers from launching their own strike. When McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at 14,000 feet, the sky above the Japanese fleet was empty of fighter protection. The 216 American aircraft represented the maximum effort the American carriers could muster that morning. Enterprise launched 59 aircraft in the first strike, Hornet launched 59, and Yorktown launched 35. Later in the day, follow-up strikes added to the total. This mass launch demonstrated American logistical efficiency, the ability to arm, fuel, and launch large numbers of aircraft quickly and safely, then recover and rearm them for subsequent strikes. Admiral Nimitz visited Midway Island after the battle and surveyed the damage from the Japanese bombing raid that had preceded the carrier battle. The island's defenders had fought off the Japanese air attacks, losing many aircraft but maintaining the island's defenses. Nimitz understood that Midway's location, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, made it strategically vital for the defense of the Hawaiian Islands and the American mainland beyond. The Battle of Midway stands as the clearest turning point of the Pacific War. Before June 4, 1942, Japan advanced seemingly at will across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. After June 4, Japan never again mounted a major offensive operation. The strategic initiative passed to the United States, and it never returned. In the 7 months since Pearl Harbor, Japan had conquered an empire. In 11 minutes at Midway, they lost the ability to defend it. The numbers tell part of the story, but statistics alone cannot capture the magnitude of what happened in those 11 minutes. The Japanese lost for fleet carriers from a navy that started the war with 6 large carriers, and for light carriers. The Americans began the war with 7 fleet carriers, and lost for in the first year Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, Wasp and Hornet in the Solomon Islands campaign. But American shipyards were already launching replacements. Essex-class carriers, massive ships displacing over 30,000 tons and carrying 90 aircraft each, were sliding down the ways at shipyards from Newport News to Quincy. The Japanese had no equivalent production capacity. Their industrial base, stretched thin by the demands of a multi-front war in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, could not replace losses at anything approaching American rates. The carrier Taiho wouldn't be commissioned until March 1944. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, wouldn't enter service until November 1944 and would be sunk by an American submarine 10 days later on her maiden voyage. Japan's trained aircrew losses were even more replaceable than the carriers themselves. The pre-war Japanese naval aviation training program was intensive but small, designed to produce elite pilots for a short, decisive war. It couldn't scale up to meet wartime demands. American training programs, centered at Naval Air Station Pensacola and dozens of auxiliary fields across the American South and West, graduated thousands of pilots annually. Quality initially lagged behind Japanese standards, but quantity in improving training eventually created a force that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Commander Fukuda, recovering in his hospital bed, reflected on what had gone wrong. In his analysis, the 11 minutes came down to decision-making under pressure. Admiral Nagumo had hesitated when scout plane number for reported American ships. He had hesitated again when deciding whether to rearm for a second strike on Midway or hold aircraft in reserve in case American carriers appeared. These hesitations, measured in minutes, had proven fatal when American dive bombers appeared overhead. The battle's lessons echoed through subsequent naval conflicts. The importance of reconnaissance, the vulnerability of carriers during arming and fueling operations, the value of aggressive action over cautious defense, these principles shaped American carrier doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. The battle also demonstrated the crucial importance of intelligence. Commander Rochfort's code-breaking team had given Nimitz priceless knowledge of Japanese intentions, allowing him to position his carriers for an ambush rather than responding to a Japanese surprise attack. For the 216 American pilots who flew from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown that morning, the battle was a mixture of triumph and tragedy. Many never returned to their carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8 was wiped out. Other squadrons suffered heavy casualties. But their sacrifice had purchased a victory that changed the war. Those who survived carried the memories for the rest of their lives. The sight of Japanese carriers burning below them, the desperate fights against Zero fighters, the race back to their carriers with fuel gauges showing empty. In Japan, news of the defeat was carefully controlled. The government announced a great victory, claiming American carriers sunk. But naval officers understood the truth. Yamamoto reportedly said that now he would have to fight the war with one arm tied behind his back. His prophecy at the war's beginning had come true. Japan had run wild for 6 months, and now the wild run was over. The 11 minutes between 10:26 and 10:31 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, represented the hinge of fate swinging. In those 5 terrible minutes, though, Japanese planning gave them 11 minutes of potential vulnerability. American dive bombers destroyed 3 carriers and doomed Japan's Pacific offensive. The 206th and aircraft launched that morning from American carriers represented American industrial might, organizational efficiency, and the courage of men willing to fly obsolete aircraft against a superior enemy. Together, those 11 minutes and those 216 planes changed the world, ensuring that democracy, rather than militarism, would shape the post-war Pacific and writing a chapter of history that remains studied, analyzed, and remembered more than 80 years later.